Right now, as you're watching this video, the entire world is waiting to find out whether the Middle East is about to go back to war. Because here is what just happened. Iran submitted what they called a peace proposal to the United States, and the response shocked everyone. The Americans reviewed it carefully, and Donald Trump stood before cameras and told the world clearly that he was not satisfied with it at all. And just like that, the most consequential diplomatic negotiations since the Cold War have slammed into a wall so hard the shock is global. The tremors from that moment are now being felt everywhere, from Washington to Tehran and across every major oil market on the planet today. Let me tell you exactly what is happening right now, because if you only follow mainstream headlines, you're only seeing a small fraction here. Let's go back to April 7th, 2026, because that is when the ceasefire between the United States, Israel, and Iran finally came into effect. That fragile ceasefire was brokered by Pakistan after a devastating military campaign that severely crippled Iran's core military strength. According to Trump himself, that campaign essentially wiped out Iran's Navy, Air Force, and most of its advanced air defense systems completely. Since that ceasefire began, there has been no direct exchange of fire between the sides, but that does not mean the conflict is truly over. Do not for one second mistake the absence of bombs and missiles for actual peace, because something equally powerful has replaced them now. What replaced open warfare is something far more calculated and equally brutal, operating quietly but with devastating long-term impact. The United States has imposed a full naval blockade targeting Iranian ports, cutting off critical economic lifelines across the region. As of May 2nd, 2026, CENTCOM confirmed that 48 Iranian ships have been forced to turn around in just the last 20 days. Let that number truly sink in for a moment, because 48 ships being turned back represents a massive disruption to trade flow. Iran cannot export its oil under these conditions, and at the same time, it cannot import essential goods needed to sustain its economy. The country is effectively being strangled at sea, and this pressure campaign is being executed deliberately, legally, and precisely. And the reason behind all of this pressure is simple, because Trump wants one thing above everything else from Iran right now. He wants Iran to completely give up its nuclear program, not pause it temporarily, not freeze it, but abandon it entirely for good. His administration has maintained a consistent position since early 2026, making it clear that zero enrichment is the only demand. That strict demand is a red line from Washington, and it is a line that Tehran simply cannot cross under current circumstances, not just for political survival, but because the nuclear program is the last major bargaining chip they still have at negotiations. So, Iran, facing this extremely difficult and constrained situation, attempted to create what they believed was a clever workaround. They submitted a proposal that essentially suggested solving the Strait of Hormuz crisis first before addressing nuclear tensions. Their idea was to reopen the strait, end the blockade, extend the ceasefire permanently, and delay nuclear talks to later stages. A senior Iranian official confirmed that under this framework, nuclear negotiations would only begin after the blockade is lifted. On paper, this proposal appears reasonable and even practical, but in reality it carries significant strategic risks and traps. Trump immediately recognized the implications behind this move and understood exactly what Iran was attempting to achieve here. He is rejecting the proposal to reopen the Strait of Hormuz and lift the blockade while pushing nuclear talks into the future. His reasoning is straightforward, because the moment sanctions ease, Iran regains leverage that is currently being restricted. Once the blockade is lifted, Iranian oil would begin flowing again, and their struggling economy would start recovering quickly. And here's where things become even more complicated, because the Iranian leadership is not speaking with a single unified voice right now. One source said Araghchi made it clear to mediators from Pakistan, Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar that there is no internal consensus at all. He explained that inside the Iranian leadership, there is deep disagreement about how exactly to respond to the demands coming from Washington. Think about what that really means for a moment, because it shows a system struggling to define a clear strategy under pressure. The Iranians cannot even agree among themselves on what they should offer to America in order to move these talks forward. And yet, despite that internal division, they are expecting the United States to accept a proposal built on that very uncertainty. Trump immediately recognized this weakness and publicly pointed it out during his remarks to the press and media outlets. He described Iran's leadership as extremely disjointed and openly argumentative, highlighting visible cracks at the top. He even said they appear very confused about what has happened recently and are struggling to respond in a coordinated way. Now, here is something that much of the mainstream media is not fully focusing on while covering this unfolding situation. While all this diplomatic activity is playing out publicly, something far more serious is happening quietly behind closed doors. Inside Washington, military planners have been preparing options that could dramatically escalate the situation if activated. CENTCOM has developed a plan for what is described as a short but extremely powerful wave of strikes targeting Iran. These strikes would likely focus on key infrastructure, in an attempt to break the current negotiating deadlock quickly. According to multiple sources familiar with the plan, the goal is to pressure Iran into returning with more flexibility. On May 1st, 2026, top military leaders briefed Trump directly on these options during a focused high-level meeting. CENTCOM Commander Admiral Brad Cooper and Joint Chiefs Chairman General Dan Kane led that detailed briefing session. The meeting reportedly lasted around 45 minutes and covered multiple scenarios with varying levels of escalation. These options are not minor or symbolic actions. They represent significant military moves with serious consequences. They include targeted infrastructure strikes that could damage critical facilities across Iranian territory if approved. There's also discussion of a possible military takeover of parts of the Strait of Hormuz using deployed ground forces. Even more striking is the inclusion of a special forces mission aimed at securing Iran's enriched uranium stockpile. Let that sink in, because this would involve physically entering Iranian territory to seize highly sensitive materials. That is not simply a diplomatic pressure tactic. It represents a scenario involving direct ground confrontation risks. If you think the situation is far from another conflict, these plans suggest the margin for error is becoming smaller. And that is exactly why what comes next in this situation is so critical for understanding where things could go next. But before diving deeper into those military options, we need to examine what is happening within Iran itself right now. Because the Iranian leadership is not only dealing with external pressure, it is also facing serious internal challenges. In reality, the regime is fighting on two fronts at the same time, and the domestic front may be even more dangerous. Right now, the Iranian government is dealing with a deeply frustrated population and an economy under extreme strain. Economic conditions are deteriorating rapidly, creating widespread anger and increasing pressure on leadership decisions. This internal instability is shaping how Iran approaches negotiations with the United States at every level. Leaders in Tehran are making decisions while constantly worrying about how those choices will be seen at home. They fear that showing even the slightest sign of weakness could trigger backlash from within their own population. That internal fear is a key factor behind the stalled negotiations and the lack of meaningful progress so far. It also explains why simply increasing pressure on Tehran may not produce the results Washington is expecting. The protests that erupted in December 2025 followed a year of economic collapse that pushed the country to the brink of crisis. This included a sharp devaluation of the Iranian rial, which had already lost more than 40% of its value after conflict. That drop came after Israel's 12-day conflict with Iran in June 2025, which accelerated an already worsening crisis. But those losses were only part of a much longer and deeper economic collapse that had been unfolding for years. Since 2018, when the United States withdrew from the nuclear deal and reimposed sanctions, the rial has been devastated. Over that extended period, nearly 90% of the currency's value has been wiped out almost completely. 90% of the value gone, leaving the currency barely recognizable compared to its previous strength. And the people living inside Iran are the ones paying the price for every decision made by their leadership. Every policy choice over the last decade has contributed to the economic hardship now being felt across the country. The ceasefire may have stopped the bombs from falling, but it has not stopped the suffering experienced by millions. The economic pain continues to spread, affecting daily life in ways that are becoming increasingly difficult to manage. In the next part, we need to go deeper into what is happening inside Iran right now to fully understand the situation. Because the internal collapse of the country is directly tied to why this peace effort has failed so dramatically. And it also helps explain what may happen next as tensions continue to rise both internally and externally. Now, there's something important here that most headlines are not explaining clearly to global audiences. The reason Iran cannot simply accept America's nuclear demands is not about pride or ideology alone anymore. It is about survival, both politically for the regime and structurally for the system that holds the country together. The leadership is trying to maintain control over a population that is already pushed to its absolute limits. At the same time, they are trying to avoid appearing weak in front of that very same frustrated population. These two goals directly contradict each other and create pressure that is tearing leadership unity apart. This internal contradiction is one of the key reasons negotiations are struggling to move forward at all. To understand this better, we need to look at specific actions the regime has taken to maintain control. One of the most striking examples is the internet shutdown that has taken place across the country. What is happening there represents one of the most extreme cases of state control seen in modern times. By April 7, 2026, access to the global internet in Iran had dropped to roughly 1% of normal levels. Most people could only access a limited internet providing basic services and heavily controlled information. This restricted system mainly allows access to state-approved news and messaging platforms inside the country. Just 1% of normal internet access for a population of more than 85 million people. That includes educated citizens, young professionals, and digitally connected individuals cut off completely. The Iranian Minister of Communications acknowledged that the shutdown was costing the economy $35.7 million per day. In April, estimates placed the direct cost between $30 and $40 million per day, with indirect costs pushing the true daily impact closer to $70 to $80 million. So the government is willingly destroying its own economy at a rate of $70 to $80 million every single day just to keep its people in the dark. That tells you everything about how frightened this regime is. They would rather bleed themselves financially to death than risk their own people organizing. And what happens to those who try to break through that wall of silence? We already touched on this in Section 1, but let me give you the full picture. Under Iranian legislation since 2026, users and owners of Starlink terminals can face prison sentences of up to 10 years, or even execution. Execution. For using internet, not for carrying a weapon, not for attacking a soldier, for connecting a satellite dish to the sky. People in Iran are being executed for doing something you are doing right. Now, just by watching this video online. And the crackdown is not limited to Starlink. Domestic media report 150,000 new unemployment insurance registrations and estimates of over 1 million jobs lost. Job opportunities have fallen 80% year on year. And one recruitment platform recorded a single-day record of 318,000 resumes uploaded in a single day. This is not a slow-burning economic crisis anymore. This is a cliff edge. People are desperate. Businesses are closing. And the government's response to every single one of these problems is to tighten its grip further, not loosen it. Now let's talk about the oil situation, because this is directly connected to why the negotiations collapsed and why Iran is in such a desperate position at the bargaining table. The International Monetary Fund estimated that the Iranian economy will shrink by 6.1% in 2026, with 68.9% inflation. The country's currency has fallen to around 1.32 million rial per US dollar. That is not a typo. 1.32 million rial to buy $1 American dollar. The rial has fallen from approximately 42,000 to over 1.1 million against the US dollar, rendering purchasing power almost non-existent when buying goods from outside the country. The life savings of ordinary Iranian families have been wiped out completely, and there's nothing they can do about it. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that Karg Island, the primary oil export terminal for Iran, is reaching its maximum storage limits, and that this could result in daily revenue deficits of up to $170 million, inflicting lasting harm on the nation's energy infrastructure. Karg Island is where around 90% of Iran's crude oil is loaded onto ships for export. And right now, those ships cannot leave. The oil is piling up in storage tanks. Satellite data showed the amount of oil Iran had in storage rose sharply since the U.S. blockade began, and as of April 20th, storage tanks at Karg were approximately 74% full after the island had taken on about 3 million extra barrels of oil. When those tanks hit capacity, Iran has no choice but to begin shutting down oil wells. And once you shut down oil wells, restarting them is not like flipping a switch. It takes months and causes permanent damage to the geological formations underground. Trump understood this perfectly when he said, Iran is choking like a stuffed pig. It is a brutal metaphor, but it is accurate. The Central Bank of Iran reported that the 12-month inflation rate through the end of March 2026 stood at 53.7%. Point-to-point inflation for all goods reached 73.5%. And what does that look like on the ground for real people? The Association of Sugar and Sugar Factories of Iran announced on April 29th that the new consumer price for packaged sugar had risen to 125,000 tomans per kilogram, up from 95,000 tomans just weeks earlier. A tray of eggs was now selling for around 600,000 tomans, or roughly 20,000 tomans per egg. A single egg costs the equivalent of what an average Iranian family would have spent on groceries for an entire day just 2 years ago. This is the reality of what economic warfare looks like at the street level. And here's the part that connects all of this directly back to the failed peace deal. Parliament Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, in an audio message on April 29th, accused enemies of seeking internal collapse through naval blockade, media pressure, and fomenting domestic divisions, and called for total unity behind Supreme Leader Mojtaba Khamenei. Notice what is happening there. The Speaker of the Iranian Parliament is not talking about military strength. He's not talking about nuclear deterrence. He is calling for unity against internal collapse. That word, internal, is everything. He is not scared of American bombs right now. He is scared of his own people. This is why the peace deal failed. Iran submitted a proposal that tried to separate the economic pressure from the nuclear question, essentially asking America to ease the blockade first. But Trump immediately identified this for what it was, If you relieve the economic pressure before solving the nuclear issue, you remove the regime's only incentive to ever agree to denuclearization. Trump told Axios he sees the blockade as somewhat more effective than the bombing, and sources confirmed he views the ongoing naval pressure as his primary leverage. The ordinary people of Iran are paying an unimaginable price for a standoff between two governments. And the saddest part of all is that neither side is showing any real sign of backing down. Because in the next section, we are going to look at what the regime is actually doing to the very people it claims to protect. And what you're about to hear is going to change the way you see this entire situation. I want you to stop for a moment and really absorb what I'm about to tell you, because this is not abstract geopolitics. This is about real human beings inside Iran, right now, as of this week, as of the last few days, and the story of what is happening to ordinary Iranians while their government negotiates, stalls, and crashes out of peace talks is the story that most of the major networks are simply not giving enough time to. Let's start with the executions. Because while the diplomats are exchanging proposals through Pakistani mediators, the Iranian judiciary has transformed into something that can only be described as a death machine operating at industrial speed. Between March 17th and April 30th, 2026, at least 22 political prisoners, including 10 who were detained during the January 2026 protests, are known to have been executed. That is an average of one execution every 2 days, following secretive proceedings marked by torture, forced confessions, and the complete absence of due process. One execution every 2 days for protests, for chanting slogans, for showing up to the street, and the ages of these people should stop you cold. On the morning of March 19th, 2026, 3 young men, Saleh Mohammadi, aged 19, Saeed Davoudi, aged 21, and Mehdi Ghassemi, who were all arrested during the January protests, were publicly hanged in the city of Qom. Publicly hanged, not quietly executed in a prison, publicly, in front of people, as a message. According to Norway-based Iran Human Rights, Mohammadi had turned 19 just days before his execution, and Davoudi would have turned 22 just 2 days after he was killed. Sources told investigators that Mohammadi had initially made self-incriminating confessions that he later testified were obtained through torture and coercion. Despite his testimony, the court rejected his claim and used the coerced confession as the basis for his conviction. Let that sentence land. A 19-year-old boy. He told the court under oath that his confession was beaten out of him. The court literally did not care, used the confession anyway, and hanged him. That is not a justice system. That is state-sponsored murder with paperwork attached. The execution of Irfan Kiani in Isfahan on April 25, 2026, sent shockwaves through the international human rights community. A protester from the December 2025 and January 2026 uprising, Kiani was executed in a process described as mirroring summary or field executions, with no transparent information about court dates, evidence, or access to legal counsel ever released. And just days later, on April 26th, another man named Amir Ramesh was executed. From the moment of his arrest, Ramesh had faced extensive legal ambiguities, documented allegations of torture, and the broadcasting of forced confessions. He was deprived of family visits for 8 months and was denied the right to a final meeting with his family before his execution. His family never got to say goodbye, not because of a scheduling conflict, because the state deliberately denied it to them. Now, what is the Iran regime's official justification for all of this? They have a very specific charge they love to use, the charge of Moharibeh. It means waging war against God. Under Iranian law, this charge carries a mandatory death sentence, and the regime has been applying it to anyone who so much as set fire to a government building or clashed with security forces during the protests. Think about that framing for a second. Ordinary people, pushed into the streets by 70% inflation, by eggs that cost what a family used to spend on food for a week, by currency that has lost 90% of its value, these people are being charged with waging war against God and executed. The UN, Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Iran, Mai Sato, reported that at least 1,139 people were executed in 2025, and 975 in 2024. In January 2026 alone, at least 100 people were executed, she said in a report published on March 9th. 100 people in a single month. And remember, the internet shutdown means that for every execution that gets reported, there are almost certainly more that nobody knows about. The regime is deliberately operating under a blackout precisely because it does not want the world to see what it is doing. Amnesty International has gathered information about at least 30 individuals facing the death penalty for alleged offenses linked to the January 2026 protests, including children. They include at least 8 individuals convicted and sentenced to death in February within weeks of their arrests. Children. Children are on death row in Iran right now for attending protests. Iran's judiciary chief Mohseni Ejei stated openly that sentences involving confiscation of property and execution for those linked to enemy groups should be carried out more quickly, declaring, "A full-scale war is underway against us." That quote is extraordinarily revealing. A full-scale war is underway against us. He is not talking about the military conflict with Israel or America. He is talking about his own citizens. That is how the regime sees the Iranian people, not as constituents to be served, not as a population to be governed, as an enemy to be defeated. And that worldview, that fundamental orientation of a state against its own people, is precisely what makes a genuine peace deal with the United States so difficult. Because any real agreement with America would require the regime to open Iran back up, to restore the internet, to allow international observers, to release political prisoners as confidence-building measures. And every single one of those actions would weaken the regime's grip on its own population. The speed, severity, and collective nature of these sentences reveal a judiciary and an entire regime deeply terrified of the volcano of public anger still simmering just beneath the surface of Iranian society. Having barely survived the December 2025 and January 2026 uprisings, the state apparatus is keenly aware of its own fragility. That is the key phrase. The volcano of public anger still simmering. The protests were suppressed in January, not resolved. The people who want to change are still there. The grievances that drove them into the streets are still there, and in fact are worse now than they were in December. The regime knows that if it relaxes even slightly, the volcano erupts again. This is the trap the Iranian leadership is stuck in. They cannot make a deal that requires opening up the country without risking their own overthrow. And they cannot refuse to make a deal indefinitely without facing economic annihilation from the outside. It is a vice closing from both sides, and the ordinary people of Iran are being crushed in the middle of it, one execution at a time. One Starlink arrest at a time, one confiscated body at a time. But what does this mean for what comes next? What are the actual options on the table? And what is America's plan B if the negotiations completely collapse? Because in the final section of this video, that is exactly where we are going. The military options are real, the timelines are short, and the decisions being made in Washington right now will determine whether the ceasefire that began on April 7th holds or shatters. So let's put everything together. Because after 3 sections of deep analysis covering the failed peace deal, the economic strangulation, the executions, the internet blackout, and the internal collapse, we arrive at the question that every person watching this video is actually asking. What happens next? Is there going to be another war? Or does someone blink first? Here's the honest answer. Nobody knows for certain. But the architecture of what comes next is already being built in real time, and we can see the blueprint clearly if we look at the right places. First, let's talk about the legal pressure on Trump, because this is something that most people are not tracking, and it directly affects his options. The US and Iran have largely halted direct attacks since April 8th, as ceasefire negotiations began, though those talks have since stalled. Tehran continues to effectively block the Strait of Hormuz, and Washington has maintained a naval blockade of Iranian ports and ships in the strait. Now, under the 1973 War Powers Resolution, a president has exactly 60 days after notifying Congress of a military deployment to either withdraw forces or get formal congressional authorization. Trump notified Congress on March 2nd. That put the deadline at May 1st, 2026. That deadline has now passed. And here is what the Trump administration said about it. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth told lawmakers at a Senate hearing that the ongoing yet fragile ceasefire had effectively paused the clock on the deadline. Democrats and legal experts immediately pushed back. Adam Schiff, a Democratic senator from California, challenged the argument, pointing out that U.S. forces remain active in the region. Ceasing to use some forces while using others does not somehow stop the clock, he noted. What this means, practically, is that Trump is now operating in legally contested territory. He can argue the war is paused. Congress and international law experts can argue it is not. And meanwhile, the Senate on Thursday rejected the attempt by Democrats to end the war for a record 6th time. So for now, Trump retains operational freedom. But it is a ticking clock in the background, and it creates political pressure to either resolve this diplomatically or escalate decisively before the legal and political situation becomes unmanageable. And that is exactly why the CENTCOM briefing on May 1st matters so much. Let me walk you through the 3 options that were placed in front of Trump, because these are not hypothetical. These are real plans with real operational details. Option 1 is a short and powerful wave of strikes on Iran, likely including infrastructure targets, with the hope that Iran would then return to the negotiating table, showing more flexibility on the nuclear issue. Option 2 is focused on taking over part of the Strait of Hormuz to reopen it to commercial shipping, and could include ground forces. Option 3 is a special forces operation to secure Iran's stockpile of highly enriched uranium. Read those options slowly. Option 3 is American. Special forces physically entering Iran to seize nuclear material. That is not a limited strike. That is a ground incursion into Iranian territory to grab the one asset that Iran considers its ultimate deterrent. If that option were exercised, you would not be watching a news video about it. You would be watching history unfold in real time in ways that would make everything from the last 2 months look like a warm-up act. For now, Trump has made clear what he prefers: the blockade. Trump told Axios he sees the blockade as somewhat more effective than the bombing, and sources confirmed he views the ongoing naval pressure as his primary leverage, but that he would consider military action if Iran still won't cave. And the blockade is genuinely working as an economic weapon. U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent stated that Kharg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, is reaching maximum storage limits, potentially resulting in daily revenue deficits of up to $170 million. Iran is sitting on oil it cannot sell, in tanks that are filling up, connected to wells that may have to be shut down permanently. Every day that passes without a deal costs Iran something it may never fully recover. On the Iranian side, the IRGC hardliners led by Major General Ahmad Vahidi are now the dominant voice in Tehran's decision-making. According to the Institute for the Study of War, this hardline position makes further meaningful concessions from Iran's side extremely unlikely in the near term. Meanwhile, a senior Iranian security source quoted by state media said the U.S. naval blockade will soon be met with practical and unprecedented action, adding that Iran's armed forces believe that patience has limits and that a punishing response is necessary if the blockade continues. So here is where we genuinely stand on May 3rd, 2026. The ceasefire that began on April 7th is intact but hollowed out. Neither side is dropping bombs, but the United States is running a full naval blockade of a sovereign nation, and that nation is blocking one of the world's most critical waterways. Both of these are under international law, acts of war. The negotiations are stalled because the gap between what America demands and what Iran can politically accept is still enormous. Iran wants to separate the strait from the nuclear file. America refuses because giving up that leverage would make denuclearization virtually impossible. CENTCOM has 3 strike plans ready. Iran's oil storage is near capacity, and the Iranian regime is simultaneously executing its own citizens to maintain internal control while trying to negotiate its survival with the most powerful military on Earth. What does this mean for you? For the global economy? For oil prices? For the stability of an entire region that sits at the intersection of 20% of the world's energy supply? It means we are in the most dangerous phase of this entire confrontation. Not because bombs are falling, but because the window for a diplomatic resolution is closing, and neither side has yet shown the kind of leadership required to walk through it. History will record this moment. It will either record it as the period when cooler heads prevailed and a deal was struck that prevented another devastating round of war, or it will record it as the moment when the last opportunity was squandered, when a regime too afraid of its own people chose escalation over compromise, and when a president too committed to maximum pressure failed to recognize the point of diminishing returns. We do not yet know which story gets written, but we will know very soon. If this video gave you a clearer picture of what is actually happening behind the headlines, hit that like button right now, because this kind of deep analysis takes serious research, and it only reaches more people when you engage with it. Subscribe to the channel if you are not already, because events are moving fast, and we cover this every single day with the depth it deserves. And drop a comment below telling me what you think happens next. Does Iran eventually cave? Does Trump order another strike? Or does this ceasefire somehow hold long enough for a real deal to emerge? I want to know your take, because the people watching this channel are some of the most informed people on the planet when it comes to this conflict. And I will see you in the next one.